The United States is in a state of confusion and surprise.
We fear this. We fear that they have something out that the majority of the people don't know about.
Olan tüm halkların hakları gibi haklar. Ne aşağı ne yukarı, ne fazla ne az.
Pent-up feelings that may result from decades of repression and people who've had members of their family killed by that regime.
A lot of killers. Get a lot of killers. Why you think our country's so innocent?
But I won't attack it because someone sicks me on. I don't let anybody use me to fight their battles.
Hello, and today, welcome to Varn blog. We are talking to Anton Jäger, freelance writer. I mostly know you from your work for Jacobin. What else would you like for my listeners to know about your work?
I don't think more than I occasionally write public pieces, but officially I'm like an academic. So that is a professional handicap, which you always need to take into account when we have these discussions. But I think that will suffice as information.
And where are you primarily based out of these days, so my audience knows the perspective in which you're coming from?
Yeah, I live in Brussels, in Belgium, where I also grew up. I studied in the UK, but I've now moved back. Oh, excuse me. Sorry, I'm just going to turn off that phone. Jesus, yeah, I'm sorry. Do you want to start again, or?
No, we're okay.
Yeah, no. Yeah, Brussels, Belgium, but I live online. Or no, I work and live online, and then I do interact with people in the real world here in Brussels, but I wouldn't deny that a large part of my life happens online as well.
All right. So things felt very different 2 years ago, and when Bernie was coming up in America and Corbyn seemed kind of viable in the UK, and Europe seemed like a slightly less dismal place. But you are kind of in the belly of the beast as far as the EU goes.
That's true. Yeah. Although Brussels as a city is extremely, I'd say at least politically removed from the EU institutions which have put their foot down here. So there's this rather dirty but apt word in German called Fremdkörper, like alien body, which has parasitic connotations, but that's not the way you should see it. But the way the EU institutions function here is that they basically are in Brussels, but they're not really part of the general urban infrastructure. So you don't actually get to see that much of the EU either in its institutions or in its personnel on a daily basis if you live in Brussels. Also because relatively, it's actually quite a small institution. So for example, Paris has a bigger urban bureaucracy than all of the EU bureaucrats gathered in Brussels have.
And what do you think that is? Why for something that looms large in the minds of a lot of the Europeans, which is seen as almost an administratively bureaucratic state, is there actually very little bureaucracy?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. There's some interesting stuff in what they call the superstate myth, or this idea that the EU is this supranational hegemon that towers above nation states, that supposedly dominates them and then imposes disciplinary and draconian measures on them. But in practice, and certainly in the last 20 years, many EU scholars actually agree that the EU is not at all a superstate. It's not going to make its jump to a supranational state anytime soon. But it's actually a sort of weird constitutional hybrid constructed by national states, mainly to shield what you could call national elites from their own electorates. So what national elites do is that they go to Brussels to make decisions amongst themselves, which they couldn't make in their national parliaments and governments, and which they then go back to their countries and say, we have to do this because we simply were told by the EU. But when you actually look at Brussels, it's like a mirage, and what you see is just national elites conferring because they can't actually find consent and support for the policies they want to impose. So in that sense, the EU is this sort of externalization of a national crisis, which is why it's not a superstate at all.
So in one sense, it is as anti-democratic as a lot of the Eurosceptics feel, but in another sense, it's not for the reasons that they say.
That's exactly right. That's the best way to summarize it. So it has a massive democratic deficit. More strongly, the whole point of the EU after 1990 or Maastricht is to have a democratic deficit. This is something a lot of people don't grasp. It's like, how do we democratize the EU? Well, it's quite difficult to democratize an institution which was precisely constructed to shortcut democracy. But at the same time, many Eurosceptics completely misunderstand what it is and think that if you remove the EU, suddenly you will be able to return to this pristine national democracy, which supposedly doesn't have a crisis of its own. And as the scholar of the EU, Christopher Bickenden, puts it, once you actually get rid of the EU, as Britain did, for example, you actually have to come face to face with an existential crisis of your democracy, which happens on a national scale. And as you can see in the case of Britain, it's an interesting but also traumatic experience.
Well, in the case of Britain in particular, it is almost one of the core ironies of history that the country that had, in some ways, the most independence and the best deal in regards to its national elites losing their ability to hide wage suppression through moving people around borders and this, that, and the other. You see why the Tories initially did not want to give in to it, because it makes their rule a lot more obvious. And yet, it's also, I mean, in the UK in particular, it's become clear that there is no alternative right now to the Tories. I mean, Labour is even more of a joke because partly their attachment to the EU itself.
Yeah, great points, great points. I think there are sort of three long-term facts about British post-war history that we need to keep in mind if we want to understand the Brexit drama, but also how it unfolded and affected, for example, the left and then the official Labour Party. The first is that Britain left the Second World War very much with the idea that it had struck a bargain which would allow it to preserve its empire. Mm-hmm. When that turned out to be untrue in the 1960s, and it was degrading on the world stage much faster than it thought, many conservative and national elites actually turned to the EU as a way to safeguard that former imperial role without remaining in imperial power. So there's this famous saying, I think, by a Tory peer, which says, like, if we don't join the EU, we'll basically become Sweden with a nuclear bomb or something like that, mm-hmm. which obviously they didn't want to do. So that was one elite incentive for going into the EU. I think the second thing that explains the Brexit drama is the very unique setup of the British state and its parliamentary system, is because you don't have a written constitution and you're moved to a form of parliamentary government. Weirdly enough, even a conservative even a conservative political culture like Britain's is quite resistant to the hardcore constitutionalization of politics, which the EU practices. So they're not quite used to ruling in this way, the British ruling class. So they like the EU for certain things if you need to tame labor, but when you need to do other things, they don't quite like the constant rule-making and the nitty-picky legalism. And then the third turning point in that history, I think, is 2011, when the ECB, or the European Central Bank, hikes its rates and thereby induces a recession into the Eurozone, basically pushing millions of mainly Mediterranean youngsters into unemployment, while the Bank of England continues to lend quite liberally. And this basically means that Britain becomes the employer of last resort to the rest of Europe because it has a labor market in common with the rest of the EU. So that pushes a massive group of people who can't find employment in their own countries onto the British labor market, which is structurally dependent on low wages. And that inflames, or I'd say creates, a specific immigration debate, which is also quite distinct from debates in other European countries, precisely because Britain has such a uniquely open labor market. And I think those three factors really explain why Brexit happened in the UK. And I think it also explains just why the left and the Labour Party and even the Labour Party today has such massive difficulty for coming up with an alternative to this order, even when the Tories find themselves in this seemingly intractable crisis.
It does seem like the Tories will become hyper unpopular, and yet Labour is not able to unseat them. And what looks like, if current predictions are accurate, decades. There might be decades before we see another Labour government. There's one key point, though, I think that we should be looking at, because we know what we're looking down the barrel of a new gun as soon as this COVID is over. It probably won't be over, actually. We'll probably still be doing with some variant or another. The Fed and the Bank of Canada have both indicated they're about to raise interest rates, and people are calling it a Volcker shock. It will probably have the effect of a Volcker shock, with the exception of, we have a market where we have a lot of people outside of the labor force, so it won't lead to probably a lot of unemployment, but it will lead to wage stagnations and probably in real terms wage decline, as well as the inability to fund things. This is going to have ripples throughout Latin America that'll be devastating. Is the EU or the UK central bank also pivoting in a similar way? Like, are they also expecting to try to tamp down on demand pool inflation by raising rates?
And I must say, I haven't seen an official announcement on behalf of the ECB or sort of monetary authorities in Europe which are planning this Volcker-style shock, although there are obvious voices that are asking for it. I think there are more and more elite voices also in Europe which realize or have learned at least something from their disastrous response to the 2008-2009 euro crisis, is that if you mess up this recovery, there might be scarring or sort of permanent damage, not only to the economies of the Eurozone as a whole, but also to the political structures of the Union. The problem is simply that the mandate of the ECB is so constrained, and Germany just has this structural incentive for deflation that they might still do a recovery, but it might not be big enough. So I don't think they're in for a Volcker shock, but I don't think they are up for a recovery program that's actually ambitious enough. At the same time, so many EU elites, certainly after 2011, when the ECB was just this monument of immobility and recalcitrance, sort of monetarist radicalism, have basically come to accept that the Federal Reserve is the global lender of last resort, is a sort of shadow sovereign of our globalized world, and they're in charge anyway. So the coordination which happens between the ECB and the Fed, which already happened after 2009, 2011, has continued today. And it's also this weird way in which a US empire on the wane can weirdly still preserve its power by basically becoming this, how should I call it, mono-commodity export economy, which just sends dollars across the globe or something. And EU elites know this very well.
I mean, we shouldn't forget the U.S. is still either the second or third in purchasing power terms most productive economy in the world, but China far outpaces it. But there's another problem there too. Even if you were to pivot to China, China's central banks doing its dual exchange rates are keeping the yuan strong, meaning that it's effectively deflationary there as well. So there's no real way, like even if you were to give up on using the Federal Reserve basically floating the entire world through currency exchange, which in a backdoor way is also the U.S. military floating the entire world's economy. It also means that you can't really pivot to China to do that. And at this point, as we're talking, and people will be listening to this in the future, this is the end of January in 2022. We also have increased tensions between NATO and Russia. Now, I've been bringing up, I think I've mentioned in 3 different podcasts lately, but that we must read Russia's actions as rational, but trying to use its unique energy and military power, which it has far outstrips economic power, to build economic power. And I think you see this even in the way it's treating neutral countries like Ireland, who is not really part of NATO, where it's been trying to intimidate Ireland recently by running war games off of the fisheries. So it looks like Europe's in kind of for a bad time, where all options it could pivot to are not really going to be. I mean, the US just doesn't care about European interest anymore, let's be honest. China does a little more and would like to gain ground there, but beyond the Belt and Road Initiative, it knows it's not really playing with someone it can boss around. So it has no real interest in like sweetheart terms either because of that. And then that pretty much leaves Europe sort of in lurch between a bunch of different factions that are opposed to each other, with Russia basically able to kind of hold the energy economy of the EU in a little bit of tension.
It's a scenario in which Europe aggressively provincializes itself. So it's not even external players that are doing it. It's doing it itself, which is, I guess, both a traumatic but also very interesting experience, because it's a confrontation of Europeans sort of surviving sense of post-imperial superiority. And I think there are essentially three factors which the current EU crisis can explain. The first is the arithmetic of electoral politics in the EU and Eurozone at large, but mainly in Germany. So if you have a German coalition system in which one party inevitably has to ally with another, and one of those parties commands a base which is existentially opposed, for example, to nuclear energy and wants to denuclearize, while at the same time the social model of your country is based on exports and therefore on competitiveness and therefore on low wages, and you have maintained your industrial base like in Germany, it's just very obvious that you cannot afford fluctuating gas prices from abroad. If you want to keep your industrial model going, and if you want to placate these green voters because you can't have nuclear, then there is just simply no way that you will accept a gas price, which will mean that some of these industrial capitalists will not be able to keep their factories running or warm. And more than a sort of sense of war guilt or opportunism in the German diplomatic corps, it is this essential fact: if your export economy, whose social pacification model relies on competitive disinflation and on energy imports, then you will not want to anger the person you're importing energy from. So Europe basically finds itself in this position where it's like reasonably strong and has all these assets, but it's completely cornered by these weaker players who have way more strategic sense. Because, for example, after the sanctions in the 2010s, Putin actually aggressively reduced its dependence, or Russia's dependence, on foreign oil imports, and like in a sense also decreased financial dependency on Europe and on the dollar. So it pivoted to China in its own way. Europe has done nothing of the sort. For 60%, most of those gas exports are still coming from Russia. And that is also the reason why on Putin's clock, he can afford the threats of an invasion now, because he knows that the EU, and mainly Germany, which is basically the sort of tacit hegemon of the EU, can absolutely do nothing about it. So it's this extreme version of the old is dying and the new cannot be born, in which we've been stuck for almost 2 decades now. But I don't think the new will ever be born in Europe unless it is through some kind of external induction or shock.
Yeah, unfortunately for Europeans, and I know even some of the best anti-Europeans in Britain can't get over their anti-Americanism, which I both understand, but and get. But I've also been always skeptical with Europeans being anti-American, because it does seem like a little bit of just like, well, you're jealous we stole your empire.
It's fun. You should grant it to us.
Go ahead.
It's a sort of cheap indulgence. Like, if we can't do that, what can we still do?
Right, exactly. But in a very real sense, I think declining American power is going to affect Europe profoundly. And I don't just mean Britain, because Europe got a deal in the post-war compact from the United States that's historically unprecedented, and partly because of the US's unique and historically weird situation of being a crisis that should have destroyed capital is wiped out by a war, and the U.S. has all its productive capacity and no one else does. Thus, literally having in about, 16% of the world's population or less, 50% of the world's valorizable wealth resources. And we were pretty willing to be super generous and treat Europe as equals with that, kind of as a buy-off, kind of to build to rebuild the transatlantic superpolity that kind of was the British and French empires. But we stopped it with Europe. We didn't extend it to like Latin America or whatever, because we can't have that too close to home. So this is, and yet, even if China wanted to do that with Europe, and despite China's relative prosperity to the developed world, quote unquote, even though we should just admit it's fully part of it now, people calling it semi-periphery would also have to call Germany semi-periphery, which is kind of a joke. Europe doesn't have, like, China could not make the same kind of deals with Europe that the US could in the post-war social contract in the 50s and 60s. And I mean, there's a whole lot that implies. One, I mean, not, and I'm going to sound almost like an American conservative there, but there is a point where, like, well, if you want to have all these benefits of empire, you kind of need to pay for your own military, and only France seems to be willing to do it. So
that's an excellent point, and the French exception, and even Macron is pursuing it, is very telling there, also because France is one of those last remaining European countries which took a very long time to officially join NATO, and which refuses to station American military gear or American military tools on its territory. Wolfgang Streeck has often been saying this about Germany, is that if Germany actually wants to grow up as a 21st century nation state, it should actually think about not outsourcing its military capacity to this imperial hegemon. Because he also says we can build up a military that's big enough to withstand an invasion without making it that big that we can wage another invasion. So this, he says, is like this decent Republican conception of what military deterrence looks like. And because Germany is completely unwilling to have this conversation in its current political culture, which obviously has all these historical factors that precede it, you're in this very weird situation where Germans are extremely pro-American. So some German Greens are more pro-NATO than even American conservatives. They literally call the 1945 American occupation of Germany successful regime change. And this is why, for example, the US should have invaded Syria and should now invade Ukraine as well. But at the same time, they're not willing to actually spend anything on the military, and they want to keep their military expenses low. At the same time, there's this other phenomenon in Germany and in Europe at large, which I'd say is a late Americanization of European political culture. So many themes and motifs and symbols are borrowed from the US. Some Europeans know more about the intricacies of American presidential politics than they know about their own party systems. So they will be able to tell you about the swing voter in Ohio, what their moods are, rather than how this specific German province, which is like key to the German chancellorship, will vote. But at the same time, this goes hand in hand with an actual decline of American influence on the world stage in many ways. So there's this paradoxical negative correlation between the US leaving the scene of world history or the stage of world history, while Europeans identify themselves ever more strongly with American political affairs. And I think the metaphor we stumbled upon at one point is like the US is like this dying star that sends its light across the universe. And in its dying moment, it is ever more bright and ever more uniquely flashy than it's ever been.
I both agree with that, but also I think it's interesting because what I keep on hearing from people who comment on my, particularly in the United States, is, oh, another hegemon's going to rise. And I'm like, okay, fine. But the conditions that the U.S. existed under were exceptional, not because of the U.S., but because of a series of events having to do with world capital, of which the U.S. just kind of lucked out on. And also, I mean, it's also kind of why we've been uniquely bad at empire compared to, say, the British, for example, because we don't have 200 years of building it up. And we have our own internal empire, which our nation is. But overseas naval empires, that was new to us in the 20th century, and we don't really have a stomach or history for it in the same way. And I think that has led to things like, for example, I always hate to, you know, Neil Ferguson's one of the intellectual villains of history, but I make this point all the time. He was right that the U.S. like wouldn't own up to the fact it needed a civilian infrastructure.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Like, yeah, I mean, and the only place we did it was Japan and Germany, and that's where it kind of worked. So it's, you know, it's hilarious.
I mean, Neil Ferguson is definitely one of the smartest historians on the right. I've devoured most of his books in the last 5 years, and I strongly recommend them. But the point you make about the uniqueness of American imperialism and its differences and distinctions with previous imperial hegemons, I think it mainly attributed to the fact that the US, certainly in the 20th century, was the first empire in history that was integrally and completely capitalist. Right. So what is very specific about the British Empire in the 19th century is that it is capitalist at its core, but the way it externalizes its world domination is that it reproduces these sort of semi-feudal or neo-feudal forms of surplus extraction across the globe to cater and to serve its internal capitalist interests. So, for example, what they did with the Indians, where they aggressively deindustrialized India purely to turn it into the grain reservoir for its own industrial working class in the core, this is something that the US weirdly didn't do insofar as they allowed Japan and Germany to actually become export powers and kept their own internal markets open to German exports. And there is actually quite a lot of work that shows that in the 1970s, American deindustrialization accelerates precisely because the US has this weird imperial role in which it says, but our strategic alliances oblige us to keep Germany's access to our markets at the same time. And what you now see with the US role, or that sort of specific capitalist role, actually not working in its favor and a specific form of financialization kicking in, you can see that Europe is quite confused or very, very despairing in some cases, precisely because it doesn't quite know who to turn to. And this is what I was talking about with this sort of aggressive identification with a paternal father figure that's leaving and who you're making all these demands to, even if they're posed in a negative sense. I mean, the US is uniquely racist, the US is like uniquely predatory, et cetera, et cetera. Right.
I mean, one, if anyone's ever lived in Europe, calling the U.S. average individual uniquely racist is a hilarious proposition.
This is one of my favorite topics. I can go on in this. I think the U.S. doesn't, like, Americans don't quite realize how bad Europe is in these terms. The U.S. is uniquely racially tolerant, but it has these structural inequities in labor markets and in wealth, which make more impersonal forms of racial inequality seem very bad. And they're much worse than in Europe, precisely because Europe is less unequal and actually didn't underdevelop its welfare state. But in interpersonal terms, Europe is so much worse than the US. And speaking from Belgium, I can give you anecdotes which I think would get anyone who was in American primetime TV instantly fired. And anyone in Europe who does that can still keep their jobs.
And this is true for the developed parts of Southeast Asia too, actually, but in East Asia. But also, actually, weirdly, the stereotype of the racist American maybe plays in China, but in Japan and Korea is not really part of their conception of why we're bad. Like, they have other reasons for disliking us, but that's not one of them. And I've always found that kind of amazing. And for the reason why you say is because in America, in American discourse about race, we conflate structural racism and bigotry often, even when people theoretically separate the two. Whereas in Europe, it can be quite interpersonally bad and sometimes even structurally bad. I mean, the guest worker system is kind of a nightmare, and has partly led to why, for example, immigrants from the Islamicate world do better in the US than they do in Europe. And this is a fact that people, despite all the anti-Muslim sentiment in America since probably the 1980s, has not led to the same kinds of anti-Muslim sentiment that you see in Europe. And when the American right adopts it, they pretty much adopt it purely along European lines, actually. Like, they just pick up the European rights talking points.
Yes, the Orban craze recently, I think, marks a escalation in that transfer. But I think before the general rule holds. And I think there are three factors which really contribute to the severity of these European racism. The first is Europe just has less open labor markets than the US has, because most economies, unlike the British one, which, interesting enough, is also a country in which interpersonal racism has declined quite severely, quite impressively in the last 30 years. They're not low-wage economies. And secondly, because European nationalisms are simply a bit less civic or less sort of pluralistic than the American one is. Their notion of a canon, or their notion of what national identity is just more rigidly cultural and ethnic than the American one is. And even like American nativism always has this integrationist edge, which is sometimes quite difficult to detect in European nationalisms.
The concept of whiteness is basically because we wanted to get the good Europeans in, and we just kept expanding who the good Europeans were. Like, originally it's the British, then it's the British and the Protestant German speakers, then maybe it's the French and Belgians, and then, the Belgians are Catholic and the French are Catholic, but they're kind of, they look, they're pasty like the British, et cetera, and so forth. I mean, and ironically, of course, the whole issue of whiteness emerges from Portugal and Spain, which is a whole nother matter. But historically speaking, but we're going too far back in the past now. I just think that this tension leads to both sides misunderstanding each other, but it also leads to something that I've found hilarious, even in Germans. I cannot tell you the number of German academics whose anti-Americanism is actually a form of elite American cultural bias reread onto the entirety of the United States, as if they weren't just parroting New York opinion. It's pretty funny. And I have seen it more than once. So what do you make of that? Because it does lead to some interesting confusion. So, for example, the US notion of race versus the European notion of race versus the British notion of race. We use the same terminology in the US frameworks, which, yes, we got them from France, but we altered them and then imported them back. Like Macron's complaint about us is like, your postmodern, critical race theory. And I'm like, yeah, I mean, but we got it from you first, and then we did what we did to it, and then we sent it back to you, and now you're pissed off. But there is a real sense in which it does lead us to misunderstand what's going on, because it's being spoken about in the same terms that we use in America, even in other languages like German and French. And yet, those frameworks, like the average German doesn't think of the same thing as the average American does when you mention, various racial differences and whatnot.
There's a saying by Heinrich Heine about Paris and France, where if you want to talk to France, you talk to the head, and that's Paris. So you don't need to talk to the rest of the body. And I think that's the way these Germans relate to New York and the rest of the US, is that they just treat it as this metonym for the rest of the country. And then you could just glimpse the prejudices of the East Coast professoriate.
Right, exactly. And they pretty much do. But it leads them to completely misread the US a lot of time too, like completely.
Yeah, and that miscommunication is very interesting, because you're now seeing an increasing transfer, which is older, which goes back to the 68 moment in Europe, in which loads of European neo-leftists were already quite interested in the Panthers. But it's increasing and mutating in a very interesting way after the BLM protest, is that there's an increasing importation of American race vocabulary into Europe. And time after time, you understand why that is being done, because, for example, in countries such as Belgium, the conversation on post-colonialism is hugely underdeveloped, because we don't have a Congolese diaspora. We didn't actually let any of the guest workers in afterwards. This means there is no diversity community that can get a conversation about race going. So the first place that mainly these academics and intellectuals who want to start this conversation go is often the cultural studies programs they graduated in, which have an exclusively American vocabulary. But then immediately you notice these extremely weird things, insofar as the American notion of race is so conditioned by these entrenched systems of legalized segregation, which don't really have an equivalent in Europe, at least in the 20th century. So there are like inequalities in civic status, but that extremely codified form of legal segregation that you had in Jim Crow just simply never appeared, at least in the European core. And there's one
of Germany for like 10 years.
But yeah, that was it's wild period. But if I'm talking about the post-war period here mainly, where I think the roots of this current anti-migrant sentiment are really to be located also in labor market policies that were held at the time. But there's this very specific thing about American racism, which there are only a few global equivalents for, is that American anti-black racism, at least, is not xenophobic. It's about a group of people who are here in the country who you don't want to necessarily deport or get rid of, but who you want to subjugate and turn into a dominated class. So much of European racism is still intensely xenophobic insofar as it's not about turning these people into a subjugated class that works for you. It's about actually getting them out of the country and thereby solving your social questions, supposedly. And that means they're two completely different matrices. And it's very dangerous once you import the American vocabulary, leaving alone the fact that they have completely different lineages.
Right, totally. I mean, the American vocabulary has always, even when it was explicitly racist, as opposed to its anti-racist form now, been kind of trying to paper over the differences between itself and Europe. That's why it exists. But it is interesting to think about that. I find it leads to American, like not just in the case of Europe, it leads to American also critical theorists not knowing what to do about any ethnic tensions in Asia, not understanding that like most of our racial categories aren't even held by the rest of the world. And I've even seen it where I've taught Africans and they've encountered Black Lives Matter liberals, not the more radical points, lecturing them about Africa, and they've really identified with it in the beginning. And then when they start talking about blackness as opposed to Maliness or, they just shut down because they're like, no, there's a really big difference between being Ethiopian or Nubian and being like from Senegal or even being from a specific tribe. And the paradoxes kind of roll on out from there. In the European context, there is the weirdness that also our own frameworks were changed in the 60s and 70s because of our incorporation of so much French theory in particular. And the invitation, literally the invitation of like a lot of the French post-structural left, and I used all those in quotation marks actually, except for maybe French.
Okay, Jordan Peterson.
Yeah, the French post-structural left, they actually didn't really have that much of a place by the middle 70s in the French economy, which was why they were coming to the United States for work. The new philosophers had kind of replaced them at the time that they're becoming popular in the U.S. But that has led to this weird sort of synthesis where when you import it back to France, Macron, as much as ironic as I found that statement, I did say, well, in a way he does have a point in that you can't really understand even French racism, which is intense, under the rubric of U.S. critical race theory, because it's, despite its origins in Foucault and Said, don't really have it's not describing the same conditions. It's not, France hasn't been a settler society for like 1,000 years. So like, what are you going to do? I also think it's led to this weirdness in the American right as the American right finally tries to distance itself from the fact that from like since the Civil War to literally about 15 years ago, the American right was the right-wing form of liberalism. That's what it was. There was no non-liberal right in the United States. It made no sense. There's no blood. We aren't from here. How do settlers have blood and soil nationalism? It does. We also have never been part of the Catholic Church. We don't have we have an aristocracy, but not a formal one. You can't make appeals to those things. As our right wing has moved away from that, it has tried to become more and more Europeanized, ironically, without admitting it. But the notions don't really import well either. And so it's led to like, it's led to like the American attempt, for example, at conservative nationalism based off of integralist lines, which are based largely off of like European Catholic thought.
Austro-Hungary, basically. Austro-Hungary with iPhones.
Right. It doesn't work here. They keep on trying to pulling away from being racial nationalism or just being conservatism again, and it keeps defaulting back to those forms because it's not organic to the United States. The United States is not that kind of nation.
It is. The paradox of the US has always been that it is intensely religious civil society, but an extremely secular state. And this is something that also Europeans don't understand, is that no, the US is not going to become a theocracy anytime soon, no matter how much Handmaid's Tale you watch. But it does have an extremely rigid and sometimes quite zealous civil society, which can weigh on policy, but it doesn't mean they can secularize it. And what you describe is also a weirdly complementary convergence where the European right, even if it pretends to protest against Americanization through the importation of wokeism in France or this scare about CRT, which is now also overtaking European public debates, is Americanizing all the same, precisely because it's assimilating itself into these categories, which are essentially American. So once you become anti-CRT and you become anti-woke in Europe, you will be adopting the vocabulary and the language of the American right, because they're the innovators and they're the people who can give you this language. So in spite of your best efforts to not become American and to like Yankeeify yourself, you will become more and more anti-Yankee. And someone like Eric Zemmour in France or even Geert Wilders in the Netherlands are a perfect example of this. People who constantly protest about these crazy incursions of American culture wars into Europe, but who are the most proficient cultural warriors in the American style that Europe has seen in the last 10 years. This is complemented by this extremely weird and unprecedented process in the States on the right, where you have the rise of this hybrid, completely heteroclite corporatism, which has no historical precedence or roots on the right or anywhere in American society whatsoever. What's so specific about the post-war US, in contrast to these European economies, is that it never developed a properly corporatist system. Like Taft-Hartley and the big employer campaign against the New Deal after war killed that in its cradle, basically. And now you have this right, which is like fantasizing about co-determination on investment boards, which is asking for high wage growth, which basically wants to summon sort of your American corporatism ex nihilo. But at the same time, you just have to tell them this has no viability in an American capitalist class, which doesn't want any of this. While all the dreams you project onto Hungary are exactly that, just dreams.
I have seen this. It's led to this weird. I will say, for the first time in my lifetime, I have finally seen the American far left, and by this I don't mean the Democrats, start to divorce itself from its overlove of Europe, particularly France. As I say that, I should be careful because it's replacing it with new and other fun, ridiculous nonsense and projections about China or the developing world or wherever. The more interesting thing I see, though, is like it is becoming obvious here that, for example, the American far left, until from the end of the Soviet Union, 1992, until basically 2015, was downstream of British Trotskyism almost entirely, as far as its relationship.
You said it. That's right.
Yeah. Now Trotskyism is gone. It is almost completely eradicated. I mean, there is still the IMT, and I guess it's still also very British. But in general, with the fall of the ISO, with the assumptions of SALT and all these things into the DSA, and the DSA is really, I mean, I feel like it's becoming obvious even to diehard DSAs that they've been assumed into the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, that you have two largely symbolic and non-viable politics in America that have weird relationships to Europe, but like, and can affect things on the margins, but do not translate to the centers of American capital at all. And so what they say becomes very useful in the culture war, actually kind of like the EU is, as far as like in hiding what American elites are actually going to do. It was very useful for Biden, for example, to have these debates. And as soon as it became clear that those debates were a distraction, the American left had no response. What I find interesting, though, is you can't, the European left seems to be in just as dire straits, but for different reasons. And reasons that are harder for me to parse out, because one thing we can say is while the European right sounds more and more like the American right, and labor sounds more and more like American Democrats, that's been happening for 2 decades since Blair. That hasn't been true of continental Europe for until fairly recently. And yet I'm hearing it now that it's beginning to happen as it seems like it's irrelevant. You know, I guess that dying star metaphor you made earlier is part of this, but how far has that gone? How far has the European left Americanized?
I think your point about until very recently is quite important, insofar it is now Americanizing. So the prophecy is being fulfilled even with a significant delay. I think the main factor is that the decomposition and erosion of European party democracy, in which parties, whether you're in a majoritarian or a presidential or a sort of coalition system, are increasingly cartelizing and becoming state departments. So they don't have any mass membership anymore. They don't have any popular bases. It's basically this void described by the Irish political scientist Peter Mayer. This holds both on the left and the right, is bringing Europe into this very weird and unprecedented situation in which it's becoming a collection of partyless democracies. And that obviously makes it seem as if you're closer to the first properly partyless democracy, in which parties have always been state departments with which you just collect spoils and rob the public. And that's the United States.
Yeah, we invented the idea of non-mass parties. Like,
yeah.
like,
I mean, I will say, as an historian of the late 19th century United States, there have been mass parties, like the People's Party and the American Socialist Party, and even like
right.
Greenback parties or the Farmer Labor Party were actual mass parties.
Factions of the 2 major empty parties that were actually mass too.
Yeah,
but
and I will say that even the Democrats and Republicans used to have this by proxy relationship to a way more densely organized civil society than they do now. So even if they were state departments, they were still connected to these brokerage and civic groups by which they actually interacted with civil society. And I think a version of the Peter Mayer void thesis also applies to the post-war United States, in which the Democrats and Republicans purely become these floating donor machines, which don't have any relationship to associations in civil society at all. No. But what's happening in Europe, I think, is a more unprecedented development, is that European party democracy is imploding. What's taking its place is either these technocratic vehicles, which are basically just state cartels, or it's these populist pop-up parties, which mainly work with digital means. And at the same time, because European democracy has constitutionalized, it's also becoming more presidential. And if you just add up all those criteria, what does that type of political system look like? It's
like the United States.
Yeah. So what would be the corresponding political culture? Well, American political culture. So why should we be surprised?
And also, I mean, it means weirdly that we're talking about stateless, mass partyless democracies. The irony of that is that while superficially that sounds more democratic, but in reality, it's way less so. Like,
oh, definitely, yeah.
And of course, as democracy seems less democratic, people are more fed up with it. So autocratic reactions become, more obvious. Also, I do think both European and American political cultures in their intermediate level, and the U.S. has way more intermediate levels than Europeans seem to have any grasp on. We are not a centralized country. It's not how we work.
You can still elect local judges, something which is completely unimaginable here.
Yeah. You can elect all kinds of things depending on what state you're in and where you're at. We elect coroners, for Christ's sake. Like, it's
completely unimaginable here.
And yet, because of the centralization of our media, all this is not watched at anybody's level anymore. Those civic institutions that used to watch them on the local level, of which the parties have relations, are gone. So what drives things now are national politics in ways that seem to just, like, you can just make stuff up now. This, of course, also leads to hyper complication, because there's now all these administrative systems that are just on autopilot doing what they do, which is like making more and more complicated administrative systems. This is a recipe, actually, for promoting strongmen historically. Like, that's not just the US, but we've never seen this emerge out of a fully capitalist nation, except maybe in modern Germany. So, but the Nazi parallels are also misleading, because the United States is not the equivalent of, like, the third most powerful capitalist state. It's the first most powerful capitalist.
Yeah, and I think there are two other factors lacking for the Nazi scenario, whatever
There's a bunch of factors, but yeah, I was like, what
yeah.
two would you say?
So densely organized civil society, so intense mobilization both on the right and the left. And I think a key factor for any fascist takeover is the threat from the left, like a very strong semi-communist threat from the left. That is the key factor, both in the Italian, the Hungarian, and then in the German case. And obviously, those two factors
exist in the United States.
No, that absolutely does not exist in the United States. The American left is nowhere remotely to being even in a pre-revolutionary situation. And what this basically means is that Bonapartism is an option. Like, there are authoritarian forms of capitalist statecraft that are non-fascist, such as Bonapartism, which did rely on a heavily demobilized and atomized civil society and population, which is also very bad, which can be a pretty unpleasant regime to live under. But that doesn't mean you actually have to call it fascist purely because you like the rhetorical flair that brings with it.
It also leads to misleading things, like in America, the right. At the same time, I'm hearing not just far leftists, but liberals talk about civil war with the right as a white identitarian movement. The numbers on the ground actually indicate the right is becoming less and less white by the day. And that's throwing everyone's calculations
and it's also off. Like a heavily digitalized movement, like so many of these European far-right movements. It does share this characteristic, is that it's quite nebulous and liquid, that it radicalizes people in these extremely atomistic, individualized settings. But it's not like it has these sort of squadristi or fascist fight squads, which you used to have in the 1920s and 1930s. I know, like, proud boys with guns are quite scary and they can do a lot of damage. But the crowd that actually overtook the Capitol on the 6th of January was anything but like a militarily drilled mass, which you could see organize a sustained,
which is why 4 of them died from, like, overexertion, like, and one of them got shot by a scared cop through glass.
There's one other thing about Trump which is key. Just imagine any fascist leader in the 1920s or 1930s saying what he said about McCain in Vietnam.
Oh yeah, that's not
for two movements who have this cult of the warrior and the aristocracy of the trenches that came out of 1914-19. For Trump to say, like, this dude is a loser. I mean, how in any remote way is that fascist?
What I find interesting, though, is that Bonapartism as farce, and what I worry about more than I don't hear people talking about this, is that in the tensions between this right populism and the way that civil society acts under right populists, which seems to be nullified by having, frankly, an aging, nominally left liberal Democrat in the White House, is that eventually, and there's signs of this, the military will step in, and not just to be, this is not to say it would be left, it absolutely won't be, but it would not be the populist right either. That's a real possibility in America. I think that people I don't hear anyone talking about it, because they talk about civil war as if, like, that would imply that the strongest military the world has ever known, that basically secures all of international trade that's not involved with China and Iran and parts of Russia, would just let its internal civil society fall apart. Like, that to me is like, there's no way that's going to happen. And yet it's so far into the US mind, and also weirdly seemingly to the European mind, frankly, that they don't even consider it as a possibility.
I think there's a narcotic effect in these apocalyptic scenarios where you just long for a certain finality when you've been stuck in political limbo for so long. It's just like someone has to do something, even if it's something bad. But at the same time, you're completely right that, I mean, even if you look at these big elite security institutions, their dominant culture is left liberal. The CIA ad demonstrated this abundantly. And this idea that there's an imminent dual power situation in the US just seems wildly, wildly improbable. And as you say, betrays more about the psychology of the people who make these claims than the actual situation on the ground.
Correct. So this leads us to a kind of dismal future for the European left, I think, and which I feel like lately have been dismal futures for everybody. But like, because we haven't talked about the elephant in the room, and that is whatever government has been in power during COVID is being stuck with the baggage of being in power during COVID. And some of those countries were right wing, some of those countries like France were liberal. And as you see things being thrown out, so in Germany, the Christian Democrats finally go away, and we have this coalition, and we can talk about although you must have been laughing watching US Twitter talking about the modern SPD as somehow a historical workers' party, which is about the most hilarious thing I have ever heard in my life. I was
the people who killed the Bismarckian welfare state are still the heirs of Kautsky and Eisner.
I mean, you talk about some nominal confusion there, but beyond all that, however, they're also going to have to take responsibility for what happens under COVID, and it's not going to stop. And I've been surprised. The U.S. has been up its own ass, frankly, about this, and thus not really realized how bad some of the countries that we looked up to have also handled the COVID crisis. So yes, we know about the UK, and it's and we know about our own shit, which has been during this second period, actually presided under Democrat, has been more historically bad in a way that even kind of beyond what happened under Trump, if we are honest. But we have been on the ball with vaccines and vaccine implementation and stuff in ways that like Europe has been okay with, despite our cultural anti-vaxxers and despite the fact it's become a politicized talking point. The beginning efforts were in some ways less stalled. And this, we talk about how bad the U.S. is handling it, but the stuff I get from Europe is that the European response is all over the place. Like there is no consistent state, this like EU grand approach to which to counter the U.S. mess, and some of the messes have been just as bad as, or not quite as bad, but almost as ridiculous as the U.S.'s response. And how's Europe going to handle that?
Yeah, I think there's one primary paradox we should talk about, which is if you look at the electoral map today, and certainly after these elections in Portugal, it does seem as if a nominal social democratic left is not doing as badly as many people are saying they do. So the map of Europe is not coloring completely red, but there's some strongholds of social democratic rule in Portugal and Scandinavia. And now you obviously have an SPD-led government in the imperial core in Germany. But when you actually look at the facts on the ground or what kind of policies these governments are enacting, they're not as aggressive and sort of militantly pro-capital as what the right would be doing, but they're hardly anything resembling radicalism, or they're not even a sort of rebooted post-social democracy in any way. They're still neoliberal managers who have realized there is a return of the state in the age of COVID, and now they're trying to accommodate this to their old austerity mantras. And I think there's a confusion on the American left about, for example, the SPD. It's simply also because so many European nations start from a better base rate, purely in the quality of their welfare state, for example. So purely because the infrastructure of those states has way more generous social insurance mechanisms than the US, you think that the parties that run for election in those states also reflect that base rate. But they don't. They've moved to the right ages ago, and they're now actively deconstructing these welfare states. So the SPD is just not in any way the guardian of Germany's social state anymore. I think what gets added to this in the case of COVID is that what you have in the US is an open assumption that you basically have a subcontractor state. So the private sector will produce all the vaccines. It will even do the distribution. The US state is just there to be as a referee to let this enormously dynamic private state do what it needs to. In Europe, you have this different model of marketization, which actually maintains a large bureaucracy and administration, of which France is a perfect example, while at the same time you aggressively marketize your economy. So it's this sort of Stalinist bureaucracy, which Mark Fisher described, insofar as you have more and more state presence in the economy, but that state presence only serves to shore up further marketization. And that means the vaccine effort basically gives you the worst of both worlds, insofar as the private sector produces vaccines, which don't have the same dynamism and capacity as the US does, because you basically have to still import some of those vaccines, while at the same time, state capacity has been hollowed out to the extent that the state can do competition policy, it can help companies get their contracts, but it can't actually hire the personnel to do a vaccine distribution effort. So it has to ask McKinsey and it has to ask these private security firms to basically do the vaccination effort for itself, while at the same time creating this crisis of legitimacy, which is just constant. So yeah, like part of the Belgian government's vaccination strategy is basically written by consultants at McKinsey, who are the shadow sovereign of this state that can't take care of its population anymore.
This sounds like a recipe for disaster. So you get the worst of both worlds, both the hollowed out social structure of the United States, but also it being attached to a very developed European bureaucracy.
Yeah, it's awful. Yeah, it's the worst of both worlds. I think what counteracts it, or at least softens the blow, is that many European welfare systems, certainly in Western Europe, have survived even the neoliberal 1990s. So, for example, in Belgium, there's still a very generous unemployment scheme on which you could just dump people as Europe entered into lockdown, while, for example, in the US or in other countries, this is far less evident.
Right. But so it's helped, but it still seems like, it seems to me like with things moving slightly back in a social democratic direction in Germany, but only nominally. And with Macron holding some weird center in France, similar, actually very similar in some ways to what's going on in Canada with the Liberal Party. It also seems to me, though, it is a matter of time before France in particular falls to one extreme or the other. And
to the far right, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, it gets closer to winning every election cycle for the past 20 years.
Yeah, so, that's a very important question. I wouldn't feel comfortable making big predictions about this. I think if you look at what the French far right is mainly interested in, is not necessarily winning the presidential election, but just moving the entire spectrum further and further to the right, which means that the entirety of electoral competition just becomes a contest between the center right and the far right, which completely marginalizes the left, which is now at barely 20% in France as such. And even if they won't deliver the president in 5 years or in 10 years' time, even if France won't leave the euro or get big migration accords, France is radicalizing or swerving to the right at such an aggressive pace that it's a dream scenario to them.
And so, I mean, eventually you could even see something like a Macron government maybe pulling out of the EU.
I'm not sure. I think there's strategic autonomy they'll be pursuing, but I don't think they will ever take the risk of getting out there. Okay. And even Marine Le Pen has really toned down their anti-EU rhetoric. I think a friend of mine, Nick Mulder, compared it to Mussolini and the gold standard, insofar as you build this massive rhetorical appeal on the idea that you're going to leave this exploitative international British system, but then once you're actually in power and capital tells you to keep the gold standard, you will keep the gold standard and brutally discipline your domestic working class. And I think Le Pen has something similar with the euro, is that she needs that anti-euro rhetoric to get parts of the working class coalition together. But I think once in power and once she actually has to make concessions or deals with French capital, the part of French capital that actually is willing to wage a jump out of the euro is really, really small. Right. And given the power of French and Persian finance, I don't see it happening.
I think you see a similar thing in the U.S. with the push for anti-trade from both the right and the left. And the reality is the right can run tariffs on China as long as it doesn't actually risk the global trade system of which both China and the U.S. are a part. And also that tariffs are a small part of this whole scenario. And so the rest of that gets thrown out immediately. I mean, particularly
that's a great parallel, in a way in which we're Americanizing as well.
You see, what's funny to me, what is hilarious about this is, in one sense, like Europe and America have the least to offer each other. But while you are Americanizing, our right is Europeanizing, and the differences between us become more obvious in some ways, but completely less in others. And the understanding of the average educated urban person in either country is deracinated. Like, for example, yes, the average New Yorker understands the swing voter in Ohio or in Georgia, perhaps, but they don't actually understand the laws of most of these states and the differences within our own country. And what you're describing to me in Europe is this is increasingly true there as well. Like, you know, it's not just that I don't understand the difference between what's going on in Saxony and you know, Bavaria, which because I've spent time in Germany as a student when I was in the 20s, I actually do understand a little bit. But that also the average Berliner doesn't as much anymore either.
No, so the Europeanization of European politics is in many ways also a nationalization of European politics, much similar to what you've been describing to the US. So with the decimation of local media, but also just the rise of the structural incentives for cultural wars, which rely on the complete sidelining of these local power issues. So Republicans, for example, in the US do have a lot of leverage and power on these state levels, but they have a structural benefit in just waging their political debate purely on the federal level, even when the federal level is not even that significant for much of their policy preferences. And I think you can see a similar thing in Europe, where so much of the right conducts its debates on the European level, even when they know that the European level is mainly an aggregation of these national decision-making centers in which they have less and less of an interest.
You know what's funny? The more you talk, the more I have this ghost of Adam Perowski's book on social democracy in the back of my head, thinking like this is what he described would be what would happen in these national left-right coalitions, that they would get stuck in capital and there would actually be like rational reasons for them not to develop a workers' party, and then they'd regret it years on when they lost power, when they could not maintain a power base. Ironically, it also seems to apply to the rights in these countries where I mean, it's actually has been one of the gifts for me as a leftist watching the European right, is that waging, you know, these cultural wars at the European level is very useful for them to get power in their individual countries. But as far as like a grand coalition of like true non-neoliberal rightist in Europe, if they ever actually were to try to do that, well, they've just become each other's enemies because the like old ethnic stuff subsides. And that happens to some degree, actually, even in America, because we have regional issues that, like, the West and the South, both key points of the Republican coalition, have actually in many ways opposed economic issues. Similarly to and actually, in some ways, this puts them at a structural disadvantage to, say, like the liberal dominance of like New York and California, which don't have as opposed economic issues.
I think you can see similar dynamics in Europe, although mapped onto a different political geography, insofar as the right essentially thrives on demobilization. So even in the regions of northern France, where the Front National does well or has done well since the 1990s, the main phenomenon, once you actually break it down in political science terms, is that abstentionism motivates a certain part of the working class to vote for the far right, but it motivates an even bigger part to simply not vote at all. And this means that the people who don't vote are people who usually voted for communists or socialists. The people who do go to vote are angry enough to then vote for the far right as a protest voice. So this means that this right actually has a structural benefit when you have demobilization and abstentionism. And the other point is that so many factions of capital that support or are wedded to the right have an extremely schizophrenic relationship to the Eurozone. So you can see this with Salvini in Italy, which is basically a coalition between northern petty capital or petty bourgeoisie and the southern peripheral proletariat. And he runs on these anti-Eurozone platforms, realizing that the euro has basically hollowed out Italian industrial capacity, has put them or forced them into this captive market with Germany. And he says all these things quite openly. But once it actually comes down to a Eurozone exit, his northern base also says, like, yeah, but we know that the euro deindustrialized our economy, but we still have to sell our products to these Bavarian firms and these German companies. And we can't afford like a really extortionate exchange rate if we leave the euro. That's just going to be disastrous. Right. And then Salvini just says like, oh, let's not talk about the euro anymore, and let's talk instead about the people arriving on our borders and invading our country. And since the criteria for success on the right are always lower than they are on the left, because you have no desire to break out of the bounds of capital, they don't actually get punished for it electorally as hard as, for example, Syriza or Podemos.
Right. Well, even though their mistakes are essentially almost exactly the same as Syriza or Podemos.
Yeah, right? Their strategic mistakes are the same, but they won't bear the consequences because they never promised anything bigger than that.
Right. Well, this is a structural imbalance both in the U.S., actually of the left everywhere. That unless you live in a truly left-wing state, which I would argue there are none, maybe Cuba, maybe Vietnam, maybe, your success criteria is so much higher than a success criteria of the right. All the right have to do is survive.
Yeah, exactly. People forget this all the time, but you're at a structural disadvantage. So you can't pretend as if the left and the right are these forces caught in an equilibrium. No, the left is always behind in this race, and the right will win it because their point is just to consolidate or to stabilize a system they don't intend to change.
Right. Whereas, but in the United States, this has led. This may be a difference between the anti-capitalist left in Europe and the left in the United States, in so much that the anti-capitalist left in the United States is a subset of the progressive left, more or less.
Yeah. So its interest in stabilization is always more explicit, rather than.
So the left in the United States is actually associated with, at least by proxy, I've been increasingly joking, but I mean the joke sincerely, the party of order. And so all the anti-establishment energy seems to be on the right, whereas the left seems to be like, well, we want to overthrow capital, but not even our local Democratic senator. I mean, so that seems to be a transparently bad strategy as far as optics go, and what you see is massive mobilizations and then massive demobilizations, particularly after the Bernie phenomenon.
And I think what militates against the strategy of a dirty break, which people on the American left have been advocating, although I'm not a specialist on this particular literature.
Oh, they've given up on it formally now, but yes.
Yeah, but given the experience of the American labor movement, basically all of the gains it's ever gotten, and I think this is a fair conclusion to make, were in alliance with willing left liberals. It needed a left liberal delegate or representative in the state to actually extract concessions from American capital.
The only other time it's been able to do that is during the populist period, where it was able to force legislatures out with guns. So.
Yeah. No. So there have been other tactics, but they're far more risky and they're less prevalent. So,
and you're fighting a completely different state. I mean, you're talking about fighting state governments in the 19th century versus, the nuclear armed world superpower with the largest military the world has ever known.
Yeah. I think what that historical record shows as a well-established fact is true, but at the same time, what gets left out of that story is that the moment left liberals were able to assist the left in forcing, for example, welfare concessions or other concessions on capital, was also a moment in which there was a highly organized and militant working class to scare those liberals into cooperation.
Yeah, and the Soviet Union to scare the
Yes.
shit out of them
Yeah.
as well. I mean, so you have both. Although initially, let us be honest, the fear in the United States was not of a scary Soviet Union in the 1920s, despite whatever they said. It was of the U.S. Workers' movement and populist movement actually arming itself and doing what happened in Russia. It was not of Russia or of the USSR. And I think that's often missed when people talk about that. They think, oh, well, they were afraid of the USSR. Well, yes, but no. And by the end of the USSR, they were not really afraid of the USSR either. I mean, it was more just like, oh, that's that other thing that we can use conveniently to like do whatever we need to do.
It was also the USSR that had long given up on any of its global revolutionary ambitions.
Right.
So why would you worry about it? And as you say, it's not necessarily about importing or doing the tanky scenario of imposing USSR socialism in the US. It's more that if you have a socialist or a social revolution in the US, there will be this external state that's willing to support this internal effort. And that is an existential danger, I could say.
Yeah. I mean, even with like, why did the FBI take the Panthers so seriously? People have not actually asked this question. It was never more. I think the Panthers at their height was like 6,000 people. Because the Panthers enjoyed popular support about 70% of the black population, which even at the time was probably about 20%. About 15% of the US population. And then the other thing is it appealed to China. And so it seemed like it had external support. And those two things together, one by itself was not enough to make the U.S. State Department care. You look at the way it treated the Panthers versus the way it treated, say, the Revolutionary Communist Party or the CPUSA, either one of those formations. It didn't really take those seriously. It sent in some people to like mess around and cause splits, but it like one person got shot by accident by a local cop. Like, it was not what they did to the Panthers, where they were trying to like engineer massacres. And we know about the obvious one, but it's not just that one. There was all kinds of like putting Panthers in deliberately coalitions with gangs so that the gangs would act out and shoot them. Like, and the reason for that was the mixture of outside state support and internal movement. I just one of those by themselves did not really scare anyone. I think that's important, but I also think like this has led to a lot of delusions in America. I actually don't know if the European left have the same delusions about those same Cold War scenarios being played out by China, or for some weird reason they think Russia now. This is really delusional. There's no like it would be like expecting my friend Stephen Hamill came on. It's like, yeah, bombing China would be like bombing the industrial breadbasket of Detroit in the middle of World War II. No one would want to do that because like no one could get their shit made. And similarly now, in a way that means that like the level of antagonism between, even if you assume that China is really sincerely attempting to be a socialist country, which I think is an irrelevant question, actually, it's just not relevant. It doesn't matter. There's no incentive for that to really happen. So there might be incentive to increase tensions or to throw. I mean, we know actually for a fact that Chinese billionaires are occasionally give money to U.S. left groups to do this or that. We know it for a fact, but there's no incentive for the kinds of things that like a younger China was willing to do with the Panthers in the 1950s and 60s. And there's definitely no incentive for China to, I don't know, be at the forefront of encouraging global revolution against all the bourgeoisie in the world. Like
there's an interesting convergence between the sort of China-phobic or Sinophobic libs and rightists and then the tankies, is that they both sincerely believe that the 1980s didn't extinguish this Maoist global revolutionary ambition.
Right.
And China was not going to become this contained developmental state that basically initiated one of the biggest or the biggest industrial jump in human history. But it's not clear at all that the Chinese elite at this point has anything resembling the sort of imperial ambitions which Britain had in the 19th century. That just seems wildly improbable. And to see it as this translation of empire into the 21st century, where you have this Arrighi-style cycles theory, where it's like Britain takes over from the Netherlands, and then the US takes over from Britain in the 20th century, and now the next capitalist hegemon will arise and take over from the US. I don't think that theory holds at all, and I don't think anyone in China is in any way ready or planning for that transition.
Absolutely not. And that's a non-fear. Like, there are war hawks in the Politburo. They do exist. There is an equivalent to a Chinese neoconservatism within the Communist Party. That is real. But they're not the predominant forces. And whenever they start getting a little bit too uppity, Xi starts dialing back the anti-US rhetoric, as we've seen in the last year. What I would say in regards to China, what we have to just be careful about is like, no, all that China seems to really want is to be the largest regional player in Asia, and to have influence as equals with what it sees will be the regional powers, which will be, it sees as Russia, the Eurozone, China, Africa is still up for debate, and then the Americas will be dominated by the US. That is more or less the conception of which China thinks it will be operating in the world. And frankly, that is also the conception that which I think about half the US policy establishment thinks it will be operating.
There's this weird revenge of Kautsky's ultra-imperialism in this story, insofar as
yes,
he was wrong in 1914, so his ideas died in the trenches, as Trotsky said. But in many ways, he did turn out to be quite right in 1945, insofar as there was this long capitalist peace between the main imperial powers. And I don't think his ultra-imperialism thesis has any less applicability in the 21st century. I don't think his thesis excludes the possibility that there's like profound instability and there's violence. Like the Cold War was an era of supposed capitalist peace, which was also insanely violent, and in which you have these Cold Wars that repeatedly turn hot, which killed amounts of people that sometimes equaled numbers from the Second World War. But at the same time, the core of the thesis did seem to hold up, and I don't see any reason to discard it for the 21st century.
I mean, ironically, one thing I pointed out is like, well, Lenin's model of imperialism is based on highly centralized state national capitals. The centralization of capital has now gone beyond any particular state. Like, it is centralized at a multinational level, not even a national one. And so it is, in a weird way, if you read Bukharin's, not Lenin's, but Bukharin's theory of imperialism, Bukharin hints at this possibility, but more or less agrees with Lenin. But what we've seen is like, oh no, we went through that period, and now Kautsky, picking up actually from Hobson, it just sort of was off about the intermediate how we got there.
I mean, it was a horrific intermediate period, which did make him seem spectacularly wrong. But in the long run, he did also turn out to be spectacularly right.
And I think this throws most discussions of anti-imperialism and most of the left, either in Europe or the United States, into a tizzy, because they don't know what to do, because they're expecting actors to act the way that they would have acted in 1917. And furthermore, I think this is another thing that we have to look at. The world situation is a lot more like, say, the 1850s even than it is that's a stretch. But what I mean by that is, like, you have a declining center power, but you have a whole lot of other powers that are vying for regional control that may seem to be aligned, but aren't actually, because their interests are very provisional. Russia and China being the obvious one, but India, BRICS falling apart is the clearest example of this.
Yeah. And there are interesting similarities between late 19th century Bismarckian Germany, the specific model of the export-led industrial growth, and China today, including the sort of highly centralized and bureaucratic nature of both states. And it's also implicit in so many of the second Gilded Age stories we tell ourselves, is that we're in this second Belle Epoque in which you have this long capitalist peace and globalization, unprecedented integration of commerce, etc., etc. And in the end, it will all end in this cataclysmic war, because capitalism just necessitates interstate competition, that it will create wars. But there are so many other factors that just don't make our epoch anything close to the late 19th century. In that sense, we're just not in the second Gilded Age. And I think the validity of Kautsky's thesis is just one instance of that.
I mean, my most simple thing is just like nuclear weapons exist.
Yeah, exactly.
It's
Really
like,
great point. Yeah.
It's like they still are here. We can still completely blow up the world like 127 times where there's no life at all left. So, you know.
You just have to imagine von Hindenburg with a nuclear weapon. Like,
yeah,
just
exactly.
Think about how that changes the calculus in like 1914.
Because all of a sudden, like, you don't survive these wars at all. I mean, they barely did anyway. However, it does make crises of profitability more interesting if you believe in that sort of thing. I do, but I am not necessarily a person who believes in a final breakdown thesis. I actually even might go so far as I believe in a breakdown thesis, but not a final one.
Yeah, I mean, this is why the theory has this political edge, which makes it so controversial. So the science as such, I don't think is that contentious, but people get really worked up about it precisely because there's so much politics invested into it already.
Right. And also, like,
profitability crisis theses are just inextricably intertwined with breakdown theories, whatever people say they are intertwined.
Right. And I think we have to be my pushback on that is if you believe that the breakdown theory is the same as the immiseration thesis, you don't have a lot of historical evidence to back that up. So, like, there's not Europe did not experience, you know, massive revolutions when things got worse after they got better. Like, that's not, and it wasn't the working class who led those revolutions anyway, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So, but I do think as far as like the European and American understanding of each other, hopefully people have listened and gotten that there's a fundamental difference, and yet also superficially we sound more and more alike by the day. And
yes, this is that weird sort of scissor movement I'm describing, is that we're moving closer in terms of political cultures, but being on Twitter and seeing both sides of the divide all the time, I just get a permanent sense of mutual incomprehension, because I won't pretend extensive specialism in the European case, but I do know what's going on there. And I see a lot of the US mainly by its sheer online presence, insofar as the US public sphere is very, very loud, mainly in its digital phase. And as they're moving closer together and converging, I don't get a sense they actually understand each other any better.
No, in fact, I would say we understand each other less.
Yeah,
that's like
a sad conclusion in many ways.
I mean, it used to be the way we would talk about the British as separated by a common language, but we're not even to have a common language. We just have a common internet culture. Like,
yeah, and maybe this also tells us something about the specific public sphere constructed by internet, is that it moves you closer in so many ways, and we knew this all along, but it really also inserts these separations insofar as American debate on Twitter is so intensely American, parochially American, that it also debunks this idea of the internet as creating this global civil society, perfectly Anglophone, and everyone basically discussing the same topics. I don't see that at all. Like, so much of Twitter and the internet is still intensely national, in spite of our best efforts.
And it's also like, it's class-based in the United States. It's broad, but it's class-based, and in Europe too. But it's class-based in the world is not. So, like, when I lived in Egypt, Egyptian highly educated people that I taught, who are like the children of diplomats, although locals, you know, who were getting their kids educated in English, they had Americanist assumptions and exposure to Twitter and the American internet. But the average street Egyptian did not. And this did lead to this irony that I saw, that I think some people may over conclude from, but I think it is real, where global elite culture is elite American culture in a lot of ways. And
academia is really important in that, insofar as the educational socialization of these elites happens in universities, which are taking their cues from American academia.
Right. Just like they took their cues from French and German academia in the early 20th century, right? Like, but what the internet has done is it's brought that out to in the core. I hate to use those terms, but in the United States and Europe, it's brought that out to the general public in a way it never was before. Like I would never in a million years thought that I would be seeing, you know, conservative local politicians talk about Kimberly Crenshaw. Like, Like, and the
Yeah.
internet is what made that happen.
I will never forgive the internet.
Right, exactly. And ironically, it means that critical race theory will have been more of a boom for the right than it ever was for any black person in the United States. But
it is absolutely. And there's also this this fact that the disconnect between the people and the elite, which drove this populist explosion in 2010s, also has to do with so many of these European middle classes and upper classes now keep their wealth or park their wealth in dollars. And at the same time, the lingua franca they have for politics is an American one. And if you speak whatever Dutch or French or German at home, and the people who rule you are essentially beholden to a different vocabulary and have exit options, then that's likely to produce like misunderstanding. That's just natural.
Yeah, and you can expand this by the world scale, because while in Europe and definitely in the UK and the United States and in Anglo North America, I'd say more the United States, Canada's part of this too. The internet culture is broad class based. There are poor people on the internet. When you expand it out to the world, that is not true. I mean, yes, poor people in Africa have cell phones, but like they're not really participating in Twitter discourse, I promise you.
But I think a good example of this is, for example, London journalists who, as I said, know more about congressional gridlock and the American legislative process than they knew about the composition of the Welsh Parliament, which is one of the 3 constituent parliaments of their kingdom, which is actually not a completely unimportant player in their national culture, which probably has more effect on their lives in an indirect way than anything Congress will do. But still, like, their main knowledge is American, so that's what they'll talk about.
Yeah, it is one of the ironies of history that I think Americans didn't really realize. In the early aughts, we were super happy that we finally got British state media in the United States and finally got something more than, you know, what we had here. And you could always kind of get British state media on NPR, actually, but still, we were like, oh my God, we can get good news about Iraq from listening to the BBC on the internet. And then we can get Der Spiegel, and we get the Mode too, La Mode too. And then conversely, we didn't think about the other side of that, which is like, now our shit's really truly global. It's not just an export. Yeah. It's just there. Like,
yeah, instead of the BBC coming to the US, it's more like the US went to the BBC and turned it. I wouldn't call it into a British version of MSNBC, but for example, Britain now has its own Fox News. So through GB News, which has other drivers as well, but obviously that is the irony of the situation you just described.
Although it's also ironic that that an Australian who made his money in Britain is the person who invented American right-wing media. But whatever.
Yeah,
I mean, the globalized world is what it is, and this has also led to weird things like Americans missing how much that our anti-vax stuff or whatever actually becomes discourse in other countries. And particularly, though, there's also indigenous local problems that can contribute to this. I'm really worried about, I mentioned this on air, I'm worried about Africa now because of certain anti-Chinese sentiments beginning to bubble up in Africa, and the timing of the Chinese vaccine also not effective against Omicron because no vaccine was. Being when they got the first vaccine doses in China, from China in Africa, may lead to a massive backlash against both China and vaccines, but they will also have access to American anti-vax rhetoric. And that has happened before, and people who know Africa will know this. This happened in the late 90s, early aughts with AIDS treatments as well, because of some botched AIDS treatments early on, leading to American AIDS denialism actually having more purchase in Africa than it did in the United States. And that's one of the consequences of these global things. And I think we see that, yeah, like Gert Wilder sounds like, I mean, the difference, I mean, Alexander Dugin goes on Alex Jones. I mean, like, that just to me says Alexander Dugin because he is a smart man and you sound like a moron on Alex Jones.
Yeah, but that says it all. That's such a perfect metonym.
Yeah, I mean, it's just where we are. Like, and
the globalization of American culture was, which you also see with, for example, American evangelical influence in Brazil and on the Bolsonaro project, then like Christian missionary work in Africa today. It's not sort of everyone watching Disney or listening to Ellen DeGeneres or something. It's something way scary and toxic.
Right. The shadow side of it. Actually, ironically, I remember telling someone who in Sweden who was seeing Alex Jones on TV, and I was like, you know what's funny about that? It's easier to watch Alex Jones on television in Sweden than it is in the United States.
Oh yeah. He's completely unavailable on all these Mormon websites, and then you go on these other European channels and like, wow, this is readily available.
And so not only do they think it's more prominent in the US than it is, but it's also like, oh, no wonder, like both in the elite response, like, oh, Americans are so stupid, look at this shit. But also in like, yeah, but now they have access to, like, there's now more dialogues there than there would have been otherwise. And I don't really know how to deal with it. I'm afraid of the calls both by American liberals and by the EU in general to censor the internet more, because I don't suspect that it actually is going to help.
No, absolutely no. And I think what it is about more than sort of user friendliness or safeguarding users is that it's about this disenchantment with the democratic promise of the internet in the 2000s, where it was supposed to supplant the decline of this classical civil society and party democracy. Then it was supposed to have driven the first wave of the Arab revolts in the early 2010s. And then in 2016, with the Russian bot and Trump scandal, the internet suddenly became the alpha and omega of our political crisis. And the current drive to censorship, I think, stems more from this disenchantment than it does from an earnest desire to actually do anything about the completely toxic space it has become. Because there is no denying that, but there's just no sense of what the actual genealogy of that is.
Right. I would agree with that. All right. Well, I would like to thank you. Anton, we'll probably get you back on the future. I'm trying to cover more things European. Actually, I'm trying to cover more things not from the United States, because
I'd love to, and it's hard. Like, I can feel the gravitational pull of the US just by staring at my screen already. It's really very difficult.
It is difficult, and imagine as an American what it must be like. It's to be like, hey, there are Europeans in the world, and they're not all the BBC.
You're at the center of the black hole. I'm like still circling in the periphery, but you're at the heart of it.
Yes, that's true. It having spent 10 years outside of the heart of the beast and coming back, the inside of the black hole is also much weirder than I think anyone thought it was going to get. So.
I don't think I'll ever go there. Like, this is a limit I will impose myself.
Yeah. Have you ever been to the States?
Yeah, several times. I did some archival research there as well, so I know it not well, but I know it well enough to have opinions about it, I'd say.
Yeah. It was interesting. I remember talking to Helen Sheehan on a panel once, an e-panel, but and she lived in the States, and you know, she's a good communist, very good writer in a lot of ways, but there was this. I had this visceral reaction to her describing my culture back to me, where I was just like, "This is just European elite bullshit again." Like, and I had to fight it down because, like, oh, everyone is so much more cultured in Europe, and I'm like. Are they really?
You have to realize it's self-hatred. Like, as the Europeans Americanize, they look into the mirror more and more, and they hate what they see, so they have to externalize it. This is a classical Freudian mechanism. This is all over his oeuvre. So I wouldn't worry about it at all. When you see Europeans engage in anti-Americanism, it's invariably.
I take it as a compliment, actually. I've always taken it as like, well, that means that our shitty culture has implanted your shitty culture. But I just don't want to get super uppity about it, because I also think, I mean, my stance on American culture has been like, it's just not special. Like, it's not. Like, I've spent enough. It's weird. It's strange. As parts of it are historically exceptional by accident. But most of what makes us the weird ass country we are exists everywhere on Earth that I've ever been. It's you know,
it is interesting, universal insofar as a completely capitalist country, like the civilizational peak of what capitalism is. I think it has a mutability and fungibility which makes it very, very exportable.
Right.
That's both a good thing. Like, I do think there is an emancipatory core to America as a bourgeois civilization, which Europeans should absolutely not deny.
And on that note, we will end. Thank you so much, Anton. I know we've been trying to get this scheduled for a while, so
thanks so much.